Is this working? Is this working?
Yes.
It is. Good. Okay, we've got there just about. So, welcome all to the second day. We've got an action-packed day, I think. You'll have seen from the programme with lots of talks. We have a keynote address, we have the Sir John Burnett Memorial Lecture, we have student speed talks, which are always fun. So I hope you will have a very rewarding day. There are a few people here who have only arrived today, so warm welcome to them. And a number of the award winners are attending today, and they have displays of their work available in the general milling around area for people to look at, and do take the opportunity to talk to them. We will press right on now, and my pleasure to hand over to Joe, our CEO, who's going to chair the morning session. Joe.
Thank you. Good morning again, everybody. Hope you're all feeling bright and ready to go for another fully packed day. I'm just going to make one request. I don't think we had anything yesterday, but if you could put your phones on silent, that would be great. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker for this morning. It's Dr. Mark Eaton from RSPB, and he's going to tell us about the progress made reporting on the state of UK's nature and discuss the future directions. Mark, thank you.
Thank you. Bear with me. Thank you. Good morning. Thanks for the opportunity to come and talk to you, tell you what we're doing with the State of Nature report, what we have done with this State of Nature report, which I hope some of you are at least vaguely familiar with. I'm going to start with this chap. This is Will. Will is keen on collecting biological data, and I think I'm right in saying that probably most, certainly very many of you in the audience are like Will. You're into data, you're data people, but maybe in different ways. Many of us are data collectors, like Will. We record, we monitor, we survey. Many of us are what we might call organisers. So we like to collate, to share, to store, to archive data, to verify it. And of course, many of us are data users. So we want to use that data for research, for policy, for conservation, all sorts of reasons. But we're all data people. And that means you're like Will, you're like me, and you're like State of Nature people. So I thought I'd start by saying we're all sort of a bit of a gang. Hopefully you all agree with me. And to thank all the people and the thousands of other people out beyond this room who are data people and have really, whether willingly, knowingly or not, have helped us do what we've done with the State of Nature project so far and will continue to do. Now I'm going to start by looking back a bit and then move forward into the future. And this starts in Milton Keynes. These are the famous concrete cows of Milton Keynes. Lots of good things come from Milton Keynes. Greg Rutherford, the Olympic long jumper, concrete cows, and me, actually. So I stand up for Milton Keynes. State of Nature, you wonder why I'm rambling about Milton Keynes. State of Nature started in Milton Keynes. 2011, we convened a workshop to talk about conservation data and to talk about bringing data together, to step out of our silos that we were in at that point, the bird data people, the butterfly data people, the plant data people, to start sharing our knowledge, sharing our data into high-level multi-taxa indicators, and then we started talking about the idea of a high-level summary report. And we arrived at this partnership. 25 organisations involved in the monitoring, the research and conservation of wildlife in the UK, working together with the intention of delivering a single statement about how our nature was doing. This was intended then and now to be an objective piece of work. An objective statement using the best data, robust methods, presenting it in a nice way, of course, to give a clear message. focusing on species, trying to cover as many taxonomic groups as possible. To do this, we were very fortunate. I've already talked about thousands of volunteers, thousands of data collectors. The UK is blessed with this tradition, going back decades, even centuries, going back to Gilbert White, for example, of recording. People who record, who survey our wildlife. And what's more, they record it and they share that data, so you can use that data for a higher purpose. Some of these people are involved in structured monitoring schemes, such as the UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme, following a set methodology that gives us outputs like annual indices of abundance for butterflies. Other people are contributing to atlasing efforts, so we can look at range of species and then we can compare how that range has changed over periods between atlases and measure change that way. And many, many other people are involved in recording, less structured work, maybe without overarching methods, a design or a structure, but recording a huge range of our biodiversity, many, many thousands of species, and sharing that data. And until recently, it's not been possible to use that data to discern trends, but we've been fortunate. The timing of State of Nature has really been fortunate to tap into new work. So led by Nick Isaac, Charlie Outhwaite and other colleagues at CEH, looking at biological data, trying to counter some of the biases within it you see on that slide, to discern the pattern, the trend underneath it, through it. I would tell you more about this, I would explain their methods, but unfortunately I don't have enough time, and I couldn't possibly do it to save my life, to be honest. It's far too complicated for me, I'd get hopelessly lost. But anyway, I think Nick might have talked about this at the NBN before. So we took all these wonderful sources of data, we crunched it, we collated it, we combined it in new ways, and in May 2013, we launched the first Data Nature report. Briefly, it told us things like this. So we had trends in over 3,000 species. And of those, 60% have declined. So if you look at the top bar there, the red side of that, that's 60% of the species for whether they could say they were going, we could say they're going up or down, 60% going down. We collated data on some of our most threatened species, produced what we call a watch list indicator, where we combined trends of 155 species. These are species that had been listed on the old UK Biodiversity Action Plan. When we combined those, we found a drop of 77% over a period of about 4 or 5 decades. So we've seen this drop in abundance of the most threatened species. And then when we collated national red lists for about 6,000 species, so a lot of data. I don't think we presented it in a very clear fashion, but I can tell you, as it said on the previous slide, about 13% of the species which have been assessed for extinction risk are regarded as being at risk of extinction. So we produced these metrics, these statistics, and we produced a report that hopefully looked quite attractive. It gave a bit of a historical background. It told us about the loss of nature before we'd even started counting, before our modern period of recording started in about 1970, say. It talked about our individual habitats, divided our data into 8 main habitats in the UK, talked about what was happening there. It talked about what was causing the changes in these habitats and in the wildlife within them. It talked about conservation. It talked about what is going on, what the partners and many others are doing to help this wildlife. Hopefully it did this in quite an attractive way with lots of pretty pictures, make people care about the nature we're talking about. It talked about incredibly important wildlife in the UK's overseas territories, even if then, and indeed now, we're not really able to say an awful lot about the trends in that wildlife. And because, particularly from a statutory perspective, delivery conservation in the UK is done at a national level, we disaggregated our results, we produced individual country-level reports, as well as talking about the UK. And largely thanks to the support of an icon, we were able to get the key messages from that report out to a very large audience. My communications colleagues at the RSPB, who helped promote this report, said it was the biggest single busiest day they'd ever had in their working careers in terms of media attention to what this report was saying. So I'm going to fast forward 3 years and just to show what a glamorous life. We moved from the thrills and spills of Milton Keynes to the bright lights of St Neots, where we started planning for the next report. So State of Nature 2016. That partnership had grown over 50 organisations. It's a really huge network of organisations working together. And I think if nothing else, bringing together such a partnership has really been quite an achievement. I'm really quite proud of the work that my colleagues have done and people across this partnership have done to work together. We did the same as before, collating data, bringing data in, trying to do it on a larger scale, changing how we presented things. And we ended up with headlines like this, quite similar, to be honest. So our measure of decreasing and increasing species found a slightly different result, 56% declining rather than 60, but we think that change was just simply to a change in our species composition, a change in some of the measures used, so not a real improvement in the 3-year gap between reports. Our sample size has gone up, nearly 4,000 species in that. You can probably make out on that far bar from me. That black line is the 56th, and when we looked at a new short-term period, a shorter period of about 10 years going back, we found 53% of species are showing a declining trend. So a slight tip, slight improvement. When we combine species trends, for the first time we were able to combine annual species trends into an indicator across as many species as possible, just over 2,500 species, we saw this, a decline of 16% in average species, either abundance, occurrence or range, over our trend period going back to 1970. Now, of course, with any such indicator, you have to remember that's the average, and we have hugely divergent trends within that. Blackbird is actually an average species. Over that period, blackbird has gone down by 16%, but nearly everything else has done either better or worse than blackbird, including some terrible plummets and species showing massive declines, some terrific successes and increases at the same time. Our watchlist indicator, which I showed before, had evolved. It had evolved working with DEFRA, with JNCC, with CEH and other partners into what is now an officially accepted UK government biodiversity indicator, the priority species indicator. These two lines, the upper line, sort of pinkish, is a measure using occurrence data. The bottom line is based on abundance data, but it shows, again, our priority species, those species which are identified by governments in the UK as conservation priorities, have fallen. It's 35% for the top line, I think it's 67% for the lower line. So we see this decline. We would expect that. Many of these species, those declines led to them becoming priority species in the first place. But what we wouldn't want to see is an ongoing decline in those indicators, and they are still falling despite having been priority species for a number of years. Again, there's huge variation in that, so we have those species which are plummeting, like turtle dove, but we have great conservation successes contributing data to that, like the large blue. And finally, this time we had about 8,000 species for which we had IUCN risk assessments for Britain, and of those 13%, again 13%, regarded as threatened with extinction in the UK. 2% have actually already gone from the UK. So 2% of the species that have been part of formal IUCN assessments are already extinct, such as the large copper. Now, one of the things we thought was a weakness in our first report was when we tried to explain what had driven the changes that we were talking about, that we were reporting. We used scientific evidence to do that, but subjectively so. We didn't have the sort of quantitative assessments of the impact of drivers upon our wildlife. So one of the things we've done, and my colleague Fiona, I should say, has led an awful lot of the work I'm talking about. I'm stealing the glory, really, from Fiona and my colleague Daniel Hayhoe today. Fiona led a piece of work looking at what we call drivers of change, looking at the main impacts upon our wildlife, both the things that are causing declines, but also the positive things as well. There's a lot of detail here. I don't expect you to take it all in. You probably can't read that text. But it is in the report, or indeed the paper behind it is open access in +1, should you want to read it. We worked with about 50 scientists from across that partnership and outside, using their expertise to assess the available evidence, peer-reviewed, published data, grey literature and so forth, to quantify the impact of all the major drivers of change on a sample of 400 species, drawn from a huge taxonomic range. So what was causing the change in these species, scoring that impact, and then adding that up over all our assessments to get a crude quantification of impacts. Shown in the report, the size of the arrows indicates the size of the impact, and you probably guess, if it's red and points down, that's a negative impact. If it's green and it points up, that's a positive impact. By far the single largest negative impact, or indeed negative impact of any type, that we found was for the impact of modern agricultural practices. And I think you'll be well versed enough in that I don't need to really say much about modern farming and the impact it has upon wildlife. The second largest impact, that's moving along that second arrow from the end there, was the impact of climate change. Again, probably not a surprise to you, but showing a far more balanced impact. A lot of species benefiting from the impacts of climate change, some species feeling negative effects. Though, of course, in the long term, climate change is regarded, and globally is regarded, as one of the most serious impacts and threats to our biodiversity. And I'll just point out one other thing, one other impact spread across a couple of arrows here. Number 4 and number 7 are management of other habitats other than farmland and woodland. It's basically conservation management. And number 7 is habitat creation. So we can see these green upward arrows, the positive impact of conservation work, really. So it's quite gratifying to see with all these red arrows and the depressing bit that we can see some impacts, some measured impacts of conservation efforts. So, for example, the creation of new wetlands, such as this reed bed my colleague Graham is standing in there. As well as that, the report had essays talking about natural capital, ecosystem services, the argument that we should be measuring this and really using this as a way of valuing nature rather than just its own intrinsic moral value, thinking about what it does for us. The report talks about the importance of connection with nature, particularly for young people. And it talks about the volunteers. Like I've talked about the volunteers, like we should always talk about the value of the volunteers and how much we rely on them. And it sets the UK in an international context. It used a new assessment from the Predicts project, the Biodiversity Intactness Index, to show that when you rank nearly all of the world's countries in terms of what nature they've lost, you get rather a depressing result for the UK. Right down at the bottom of that list, some of the worst countries in the world. And as before, we disaggregated, we talked about different habitats, we talked about the drivers. I think we did a better job on talking about what had caused the changes we were reporting. Because of that piece of work I've talked about, we had some more evidence behind us. We remembered this time to talk about the UK's Crown dependencies, the Channel Isles and the Isle of Man, which rather embarrassingly we completely omitted from the first report. So we did give them their own section to make up for that this time. And again, we talked about the UK's overseas territories and the immensely important wildlife that it has there. And again, it's relevant and important to produce results that speak to individual countries within the UK, so we produced separate reports. But after all of that, I think a better report, better metrics, more information, greater temporal resolution to say how change had varied through time, the results were very much the same. Again, we had Sir David helping us to promote them. Again, we were very busy communicating this, but saying pretty much the same sorts of things. So now that's what we've done. It's time to look forward a bit, talk about what we're doing now and what we want to do, what we're striving to do, given a restraint on resources. We can't do everything, we can't do all the developments we'd like to in the State and Nature Partnership, but we'd like to be able to improve what we do, and we're busy working. We're working towards a new report in 2019, so keeping that 3-year interval. We think 2019 is good timing. It's just before 2020, this sort of international year of biodiversity reckoning, reporting to CBD. I think it would be very timely to be able to say before that, to give our objective statement on how our nature is doing. Now, my crystal ball won't enable me to say what that report is going to say, what the results are going to be, but I can tell you about how we'd like to say things. We'd like better metrics. I think we will always strive to improve our reporting. It's what State of Nature is doing. Talk about the state of nature, we'd like to do it more robustly. We'd like to have a greater breadth of species in our metrics. We'd like to have better spatial resolution. We'd like to be able to report better at a smaller scale, particularly for countries. I talked about country reports, but when you disaggregate from a UK data set to individual countries, you have less data to play with. Often you don't have analyses of trends at country level, or if you do, or you try to, your data set isn't big enough, your sample size isn't big enough to support good analyses at those smaller scales. So we'd like to do better there. We'd like to have better understanding of species within habitats. Although we've split our data and split our reports into habitats so far, I don't think we've necessarily done it as well as we'd like to, so we'd like to improve that. I thought I'd show some analyses by Fiona Burns, just looking at our State of Nature data set, looking at our results from the last report. So we've got lots of data, a huge number of species, some sort of nice 4-figure numbers of sample size in terms of species, but as you can see, this is only a small proportion of the UK's wildlife. So if you look at our multicellular species, terrestrial and freshwater, not including marine in this, we've maybe got about 20% of them represented in one of our metrics, some of them in 2. So only a small proportion of the UK species. And there are some big gaps, and there are some important gaps. Some gaps of groups of species which play really important ecosystem functions. So we don't know, we don't have any trends for our earthworms, for example. Don't know an awful lot about how our fungi are doing. And then for what we do know, and the species we do have trends for, we have biases. So these 2 bars, the top one shows a breakdown across 4 kingdoms of all the UK's, all those terrestrial and freshwater species. That bottom bar is our breakdown in our categorical change figure. Mind you what that is in the top corner. So we can see there that fungi, very underrepresented in our statistics, in that statistic. 32% of the UK species, only 6% within our measure. When we look at our wiggly line, our indicator, our 2,500 species, again, fungi are underrepresented, but if we look back before, it was plants taking up the slack, being sort of overrepresented. This one is animals. We have far more animals. Animals have the sort of the indices, the annual indices of abundance. We don't have that for many other groups. So we have these biases. We can look at correcting biases, weighting species trends to get rid of this bias. I guess it sort of looks mustardy line in the middle is the trend we presented in the last State of Nature report. No species weighting. If we had a species trend, we put it in evenly weighted to everything else. If we try and correct for the biases at the level of phyla, we get a more negative result. If we do it at the level of kingdom, we get a more positive result. So there is some thinking to do about how or if we try and control for this problem, but we could try and tackle that. And then when we look at our red lists and the proportion of the kingdoms that have had red list assessments for Britain done, again, sort of reality at the top and what we've actually got assessments for at the bottom, maybe the biases aren't so great there, but we see plants are maybe overrepresented in that, but if we look at plants in more detail, we see we've got no assessments for algae, which is nearly 50% of the species. So there are big gaps in our knowledge, and it would be good to be able to try and correct those. Or even if we can't correct them by getting the data, thinking about how we present it. We want to be able to understand our data better, to be able to talk about it and report what's happening better. So I've talked about that work on drivers, looking back 4 or 5 decades in what's driven the changes we've observed. But wouldn't it be useful to know what's happening now? Not what has happened, but what's actually happening now or in the last 5 years or something. So we can say really what's happening and what's causing change right now and what do we need to address as conservationists. We'd like to know exactly how those drivers are influencing the trends we see. What's the relationship between those pressures and species change? So wouldn't it be great to say, well, this increase of 10% in this group has been driven by this driver. 20% of this change has been caused by that. And really understand the relationship between what's happening and the pressures that we're exerting on our country and how the wildlife's reacting. We'd like to understand what makes species react in the way they do. What is it about? What traits do the increasing species have that the decreasing ones don't? Are specialist species declining more than generalists, as has been shown for some taxonomic groups? Can we prove that with our data set over all of our biodiversity? Valuable things to know. And particularly, I think it would be good to be better at measuring the response of our nature to the conservation that we're doing. So there's an awful lot of conservation going on. By the RSPB, my organisation, by numerous others, across the State and Nature Partnership, by many other places, by government and so forth. We really need to be able to point to what impact that is having, to talk about the conservation and say that is delivering that, to make that link, to demonstrate that it's all worth doing. And this is really part of telling the story, of framing. If we continue to produce State and Nature reports, which have good news, they have a balance, but overall they're showing the loss of biodiversity, how we have less nature than we used to have, and we continue saying that, people will quite possibly justifiably turn around and say, well, what about all this conservation you keep telling us about? What about these memberships that we pay, this money we give you, the money we put in the huge robin with a hole in the top or whatever? Why isn't that turning things around? So we need to be able to demonstrate that what conservation is doing has a link to recoveries, to responses in wildlife. We did that happened. We expended that much resource on this was the response in nature. And maybe tease this apart. Maybe look at types of conservation. What gave the greatest return on investment? What didn't work? That would be quite interesting to know. We'd have to be honest enough to share that with you, but we should know it. We also need to think about how we measure. Maybe instead of talking about change since some point in the past, we need to start thinking about progress towards targets. Heading towards something, trying to strive towards it rather than seeing what you've lost. But if we want to do that, how do we define those targets? How do we define success? How much nature is enough? I don't think I've ever met anyone who can answer that. And finally, we need better ways of communicating. It's been a struggle. It's been one of the challenges of the State and Nature report so far in trying to target multiple audiences in a single report. That is a juggling act. So we need to think about what our critical audiences are and how we target them. Do we actually need different products? Instead of one report, do we need to do different things to target different audiences? And what are those audiences? You know, is it these? Is it people like this that we want to talk to? Is it him? So we need to understand who we really need to talk to and how we do it. And of course, we end up back with Will, with the recorders, the data providers, and we need to think about how the State and Nature Partnership and partners separately or together work with these people, our lifeblood, the recorders, the people who give us the information that we rely on to do this reporting. And I think, you know, that's something that a lot of people in here spend a lot of time thinking about, so this might be sort of eggs and sucking really, but we need to think about how we maintain and how we increase skills, how we fight the threat of sort of the dwindling field work and identification skills, so how we deal with that. We need to grasp the opportunities offered by new technology. Maybe not getting sort of seduced, led astray by the emperor's new clothes, but there are great opportunities there which we need to grasp. We need to make better use of the people that are out there. When people are out there doing their recording, can we get more from them? Can we get them to collect other things? Can we at least get better metadata, recording effort, for example, that makes the data they collect more valuable? Can we influence recorder behaviours? Will again, can we send him to new places? Can we persuade him to start looking at new species? Can we make changes in behaviour to get the data, fill the data gaps we've got? Can we develop more structured monitoring schemes for that gold standard data? Or is that not the best use of our resources? There's a question there. And finally, how can we work on the next generation? How can we fight against all the other distractions, the opportunities that might steer people down other paths? How do we bring a younger generation into biological recording? And you'll have to excuse me the additional slide here, which really isn't necessary, but once I'd taken a photo of one of them, the other was very insistent that she had to be in the talk as well. So you'll see that State of Nature is, and probably always will be, a work in progress. Hopefully of continual improvement. And that's what we're striving to do, to get better than the last report, to work between reports, to know more, to understand more, to improve how we report. But I think with the partnership we have, and I'll show that again because I really love this slide, and I always try and finish on this slide when I talk about the State of Nature report. Hopefully we might have to cram even more logos on next time. RSPB's designers will complain, as they always do, but it would be great. With this partnership, with the support of people like you in the room, people like Will out there, we can strive to really improve what we say about the state of the UK's wildlife. And I think you'll agree, hopefully you'll agree, that this is a valuable tool. This is worth doing. It's a valuable tool in our toolkit in doing what we do as conservationists. And at that point, I'll thank you.